The dust from the approaching stagecoach swirled across the parched main street of Sweetwater, Texas, as Madeline Lawson stepped down with trembling hands, her 9-year-old son clutching her skirts. The boy's eyes, the exact shade of cornflower blue she had tried desperately to forget, scanned the weathered storefronts of a town that had barely changed in the decade since she'd fled. It was 1878, and the unforgiving June heat shimmered across the horizon, distorting the silhouette of Sweetwater's only saloon where, if her information was correct, Xavier Blackett still dealt cards and occasionally enforced the peace. The man who had no idea he was a father. "Is this where Papa lives, Mama?" young James asked, his voice carrying on the still air. Madeline smoothed her son's unruly dark hair so like his father's it sometimes made her chest ache. "Yes, darling, this is where your father lives." The stagecoach driver tossed down her weathered carpetbag. "That all, madam?" "Yes, thank you," she replied, digging into her purse for a coin. "Welcome back to Sweetwater," the driver said with a knowing look that made her wonder if her return was already becoming gossip fodder. 10 years was a long time, but in places like Sweetwater, memories ran deep. She had been barely 19 when she left, carrying nothing but a broken heart and the secret of new life growing inside her. Now, at 29, she was returning a widow, with the weight of promises made to a dying husband pushing her forward. "Tell him," Richard had whispered in his final hours. "The boy deserves to know his real father." Madeline gripped James's hand tighter as they walked toward the town's only hotel. She had rehearsed what she would say to Xavier 1,000 times over the years, but now that the moment approached, the words scattered like tumbleweeds in her mind. "Mama, you're squeezing too tight," James complained. "I'm sorry, love." She relaxed her grip, wondering how much of Xavier remained in the man she had once loved beyond reason, the man who had told her in no uncertain terms that he wasn't built for settling down. The Golden Spur Hotel stood as it always had, its whitewashed facade faded but welcoming. Inside, the lobby smelled of pine soap and tobacco. The clerk, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up as they entered. "Room for the night?" he asked. "Perhaps longer," Madeline replied. "We're coming home." The clerk's eyes narrowed briefly before recognition dawned. "Miss Madeline Lawson, it's Mrs. Carter now," she corrected gently, "though I've recently been widowed." "I'm sorry to hear that, madam. Welcome back to Sweetwater. We got a nice room on the second floor with a view of the street. $2 a night." As she signed the register, Madeline asked the question that had burned in her mind during the entire journey from Denver. "Is Xavier Blackett still in town?" The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh yes, madam. Got himself part ownership of the Silver Dollar Saloon few years back. Still keeps the peace around here too since Sheriff Wilkins took ill." James tugged at her sleeve. "Can we see Papa now?" The clerk's eyes darted between Madeline and the boy, and she could practically see the calculations happening behind those spectacles. "We'll get settled first," she told James firmly. "Then we'll find Mr. Blackett." Their room was simple but clean, with a brass bed, a smaller trundle for James, and a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin. Madeline unpacked their essentials, her hands moving automatically while her mind raced ahead to the confrontation that awaited. "Why are you crying, Mama?" James asked suddenly. She hadn't realized tears were slipping down her cheeks. Wiping them away quickly, she forced a smile. "Just tired from the journey, darling. Why don't you rest a bit while I freshen up? Then we'll go find your father." James bounced on the edge of the bed. "What's he like?" "You said he's brave and strong." "He is," Madeline confirmed, remembering the time Xavier had faced down 3 cattle rustlers alone, armed with nothing but his revolver and that unshakable confidence. He's very brave and very stubborn. Like me, James declared proudly. Exactly like you, she agreed, her heart clenching. After washing the dust of travel from their faces and changing into her best blue dress, the one that matched her eyes, the eyes Xavier had once claimed bewitched him, Madeline led James back downstairs. The afternoon sun hung low as they stepped onto the boardwalk. The Silver Dollar Saloon stood at the far end of the main street, its swinging doors and painted windows promising escape from the heat and troubles of the world outside. A place where men came to forget, and sometimes to remember. "Is that where Papa works?" James asked excitedly. "Yes," she said, straightening her shoulders. "Remember what I told you. Your father doesn't know about you yet. It's going to be a surprise for him." A good surprise or a bad surprise? The question gave her pause. "I'm not sure," she admitted honestly. "But you're never a bad surprise, James. Never." They approached the saloon slowly. Through the batwing doors, Madeline could hear the tinny sound of a piano and the murmur of male voices. She hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of the impropriety of bringing a child into such an establishment. "Wait here a moment," she instructed James, positioning him on a bench just outside. "I'll see if your father is inside." "But I want to come," he protested. "Just for a minute, darling. It's not a place for children." Before she could lose her nerve, Madeline pushed through the batwing doors. The saloon fell eerily quiet as she entered, several pairs of eyes turning to assess the unexpected female visitor. She scanned the room quickly, her gaze stopping abruptly on a tall figure behind the bar. Xavier Blackett had aged well in 10 years. His dark hair now held traces of silver at the temples, and new lines framed his eyes, but he still possessed the lean, powerful build that had once made her heart race. He was wiping a glass, his movements arrested mid-motion as he stared at her with undisguised shock. "Maddie," he said, her name sounding rough in his throat. She opened her mouth to speak, but before any words could emerge, a small whirlwind burst through the doors behind her. "Mama, I saw a real cowboy with spurs and everything," James exclaimed, rushing to her side. Xavier's eyes moved from her face to the boy, confusion evident in his expression. Then his gaze sharpened, taking in the child's features, the dark hair, the square jaw, and most damningly, those distinctive blue eyes that mirrored his own. "Xavier," Madeline said softly, "this is James, my son." The boy looked up at the tall man behind the bar, his face lighting with sudden recognition and hope. "Are you my papa?" he asked, the words ringing clear in the hushed saloon. Xavier froze, the glass slipping from his fingers to shatter on the floor. The noise broke the spell. "Everybody out," he said, his voice deadly quiet. When no one moved immediately, he slammed his palm on the bar. "I said out. We're closed." There was a scraping of chairs and muttered complaints as the patrons filed past Madeline and James, many casting curious glances their way. A balding man who appeared to be the piano player hesitated. "You want me to stay, Xav?" he asked. "No, Monroe. Take the afternoon. I'll find you later." When the last customer had departed, Xavier came around the bar slowly, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. He stopped a few feet from them, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. "How old are you, son?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "9, sir," James replied proudly. "Almost 10 in September." Xavier's gaze snapped to Madeline, accusation blazing in his eyes. "September," he repeated. 9 years ago. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Xavier ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made her chest ache. "Why now, Maddie? Why after all this time?" "Perhaps we could speak privately," she suggested, glancing meaningfully at James. Xavier gestured to a table in the corner. "James, would you like a sarsaparilla?" he asked, the name sounding strange on his lips. "Yes, sir," the boy replied eagerly. While Xavier busied himself behind the bar, Madeline led James to the table. "Remember what I said about manners," she whispered to him. "Is he really my papa?" James whispered back. "He looks like the picture you showed me." "Yes," she confirmed, her throat tight. "He is." Xavier returned with 3 glasses sarsaparilla for James and whiskey for the adults. He set them down carefully, then took a seat across from them. "I was married," Madeline began, deciding directness was best. "My husband, Richard Carter, passed 3 months ago. Consumption." "I'm sorry to hear that," Xavier said, though his eyes remained hard. "Before he died, he made me promise to bring James to meet you. Richard was a good man. He raised James as his own, but—" She took a steadying breath. "He believed a boy should know his real father." Xavier downed his whiskey in one swallow. "You were already carrying my child when you left." "I didn't know when I left," she clarified. "I found out 2 months later in Denver. And you didn't think to write, to let me know I had a son." His voice remained low, but she could hear the barely contained fury beneath. James was looking between them, confusion clouding his features. "Are you mad, sir?" he asked Xavier directly. Something in the boy's forthright question seemed to deflate Xavier's anger. He exhaled slowly. "Not at you, son. Never at you." He glanced at Madeline. "Your mother and I have some history to discuss." James nodded sagely. "Mama said you might be surprised." A harsh laugh escaped Xavier. "That's one word for it." He studied the boy more carefully. "You like horses, James?" "Yes, sir. I had a pony in Denver, but we had to sell him when Mr. Carter got sick." Xavier flinched slightly at the correction. "I have a horse you might like to meet tomorrow. Name's Thunderbolt." James's eyes widened. "A real cowboy horse." "The finest cutting horse in the county," Xavier confirmed, a hint of pride entering his voice. "If your mother agrees, maybe we could go for a ride." Madeline nodded. "That would be nice." An awkward silence fell, broken only when the batwing doors creaked open and a man with a sheriff's badge peered in. "Everything all right, Xav? Monroe said you closed up sudden like." "Fine, Hank," Xavier replied. "Just catching up with an old friend." "This is Mrs. Carter and her son James." The sheriff's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Miss Maddie. Well, I'll be. Welcome back to Sweetwater." He tipped his hat to her. "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied politely. After the sheriff departed, Xavier turned back to them. "You're staying at the Golden Spur?" "Yes. We just arrived today." He nodded, then looked at James. "Would you mind if I spoke to your mother alone for a minute, son? Man to woman." James glanced at Madeline, who nodded reassuringly. "You can look at the pictures on the wall," she suggested. "Just don't touch anything." When James was out of earshot, examining a framed photograph of the town's founding, Xavier leaned forward. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. "You made it abundantly clear you weren't interested in settling down," she replied, equally low. "You said, and I quote, 'I'm not cut out for family life, Maddie. Never will be.'" "That was before I knew I had a son." He ran a hand over his face. "Christ, Maddie, 9 years. 9 years I didn't know my own flesh and blood existed." "And would it have made a difference?" she challenged. "Would you have married me? Abandoned your precious freedom to be a father and husband?" The question hung between them, unanswered. "I had to make a life for us," she continued after a moment. "Richard was kind, stable. He loved James as his own." "And now what?" Xavier asked. "You expect me to just step into a dead man's shoes, play father to a boy who doesn't know me from Adam?" "I expect nothing," she said stiffly. "I fulfilled a promise to my husband. What happens next is up to you." Xavier's eyes drifted to James, who was now studying a stuffed elk head on the wall with fascination. "He has my eyes," he said softly. "And your stubbornness," Madeline added. "And your way with animals." Richard used to say James could charm a rattlesnake out of its venom. A ghost of a smile touched Xavier's lips. "My pa used to say the same about me." The smile faded. "How long are you staying in Sweetwater?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I sold our house in Denver. I thought perhaps we might settle here. James deserves to know where he comes from." Xavier finished his whiskey and set the glass down with deliberate care. "I need time to think on this, Maddie. It's a lot to take in." "Of course." She rose from the table. "We'll be at the hotel. If you'd still like to take James riding tomorrow, perhaps you could come by around 10, he nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll be there." She called to James, who came reluctantly, still eyeing the various artifacts decorating the saloon walls. "Are we leaving already?" "Yes, darling. It's getting late and Mr. Blackett has work to do." She glanced at Xavier. "Say goodbye to your father for now." James looked up at the tall man, suddenly shy. "Goodbye, sir. Papa." Something flashed in Xavier's eyes, pain, wonder, fear. Madeline couldn't be sure. He reached out hesitantly and placed a large hand on James's shoulder. "Goodbye, son," he said, his voice rough. "I'll see you tomorrow for that ride." As they stepped back into the fading daylight, Madeline felt James's small hand slip into hers. "I like him," the boy declared. "He looks like a real cowboy." "He is a real cowboy," she confirmed, looking back at the saloon where Xavier stood watching them from the doorway, his expression still stunned. "One of the best." That night, after tucking James into bed, Madeline sat by the window of their hotel room, watching the lights of Sweetwater glow against the darkening Texas sky. Coming back had been a risk one she wasn't entirely sure would pay off. Xavier had been shocked, angry even, but he hadn't rejected James outright. That was something. She thought back to the last time she'd seen him, that fateful day in 1868. They had been lovers for nearly 2 years, meeting in secret because her father, the town's banker, disapproved of the young cowboy turned peacekeeper. When her father had announced plans to move the family to Denver for a banking partnership, she had run to Xavier, hoping he would finally propose. Instead, he had pulled away. "I can't give you what you want, Maddie," he had said, refusing to meet her eyes. "I'm not built for settling down. This badge, this town, they're my life." "I love you," she had pleaded. "And I love you enough to let you go," he had replied. "You deserve better than a man who might not come home at night, a man with enemies." She had left the next day, her heart shattered, unaware of the new life beginning inside her. By the time she discovered her pregnancy, pride and hurt had kept her from writing to Xavier. And then Richard Carter had entered her life, kind, stable Richard, who had proposed despite her condition and given her son his name. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her memories. Frowning, she glanced at the clock, nearly midnight. Who would call at such an hour? Cautiously, she approached the door. "Who is it?" "It's Xavier," came the muffled reply. Her heart jumped into her throat. She glanced at James, sleeping soundly, before opening the door a crack. Xavier stood in the dimly lit hallway, hat in hand. He'd changed clothes since the afternoon, now wearing a clean shirt under his vest. His hair was damp, as if recently washed. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, conscious of her state of undress. She wore only her nightgown and wrapper. "It's not proper, Xavier." A ghost of the old reckless smile touched his lips. "When have we ever been proper, Maddie?" Despite herself, she opened the door wider. "James is sleeping," she whispered, gesturing to the small trundle bed where her son lay curled beneath the quilt. Xavier stepped into the room, his gaze immediately finding the boy. He stood for a long moment, just watching James sleep, an expression of wonder on his face. "I couldn't stop thinking about him," he admitted softly. About both of you, couldn't sleep. It's a lot to take in, she acknowledged. He turned to face her, his eyes intense in the lamplight. Why didn't you write to me, Maddie? Even after you married. You could have told me. She sank onto the edge of her bed. At first, it was pride. You had made it clear you didn't want commitments, then, after I met Richard. He was so good to us, Xavier. He never once made James feel like anything less than his own son. And now, why come back now? Richard knew, she confessed. He always knew James wasn't his by blood. When he was dying, he made me promise to bring James to meet you, he said. Her voice caught. He said a boy needs his father. Xavier paced to the window, gazing out at the darkened street below. I meant what I said about not being cut out for family life, Maddie. That hasn't changed. I've built something here, the saloon, my reputation. I have responsibilities. I'm not asking you to marry me, she said sharply. That ship sailed long ago. I'm asking you to know your son. He turned back to her, his expression troubled. And what happens when he gets attached, when he starts expecting a father, not just a man who takes him riding occasionally? I don't know the first thing about being a parent. Neither did I, she replied. You learn. Every day you learn. They both fell silent as James stirred in his sleep, mumbling something incoherent before settling again. He has your snore, Xavier observed, a reluctant smile tugging at his mouth. I do not snore, she protested automatically, then caught herself. It was just the sort of teasing exchange they'd had years ago before everything fell apart. Xavier's smile faded. I never stopped thinking about you, Maddie, not for a single day. The admission hung in the air between them, dangerous and tempting. She looked away. It's late, Xavier. We should talk more tomorrow, he nodded, reaching for his hat. I'll come by at 10 like we discussed, for the ride. James will be excited, she said, walking him to the door. He's always wanted to be a cowboy. Xavier paused with his hand on the doorknob. He looks like my pa, he said softly, something about the chin. He has your temper too, she warned, and your sweet tooth. A genuine smile spread across Xavier's face. Poor kid. Then, before she could react, he leaned down and pressed a kiss to her cheek, his lips lingering just a heartbeat too long. Good night, Maddie. After he left, she pressed her fingers to the spot where his lips had touched, her heart racing traitorously. This wasn't why she had come back to Sweetwater. James needed to know his father, yes, but she hadn't come seeking a reconciliation. She had a life to rebuild, plans that didn't include falling back into the arms of a man who had once broken her heart. And yet, as she slipped back into bed, she couldn't help remembering the way Xavier had looked at their son with wonder and fear, and something that might, given time, grow into love. The morning brought clear skies and the promise of scorching heat. Madeline dressed James in his best clothes, ignoring his protests about the stiff collar. I want to look nice for Papa, she explained, smoothing his unruly hair. Is he really going to take me riding on a real cowboy horse? James asked for the dozenth time. Yes, if you're good and mind your manners, she reminded him. And remember, he's still getting used to being your father, so be patient with him. At precisely 10 o'clock, a knock came at their door. James raced to answer it, flinging it open to reveal Xavier, dressed in full cowboy regalia, leather chaps over denim trousers, a crisp white shirt, and his distinctive black Stetson. Ready for that ride, partner? He asked James, who nodded enthusiastically. Xavier's eyes moved to Madeline, taking in her simple blue day dress. You're welcome to join us, he offered. I think this should be time for you too, she replied. I have some errands to run in town anyway. They walked downstairs together, drawing curious glances from the hotel staff and guests. Sweetwater was a small town, and news of Madeline's return with Xavier Blackett's son had undoubtedly spread overnight. Outside, tied to the hitching post, stood a magnificent black stallion and a smaller pinto pony. "This here is Thunderbolt," Xavier said, patting the stallion's gleaming neck. "And this little lady is Pepper. She's gentle as they come, perfect for learning." James approached the pony with appropriate caution. "Hello, Pepper," he said softly, holding out a flat palm the way Madeline had taught him. Xavier shot Madeline an approving look. "You've taught him well with horses." "Richard had a small stable," she explained. "James has been around horses since he could walk." Xavier helped James mount the pony, adjusting the stirrups with practiced ease. "We'll just ride around town a bit, maybe out to the creek if he's comfortable," he told Madeline. "Have him back by noon for dinner." "Be careful," she cautioned, more out of habit than actual concern. If there was one thing she remembered about Xavier, it was his skill with horses and his protective nature, despite his protestations about family life. She watched them ride off, James sitting tall in the saddle, his face alight with excitement. The sight of them together, father and son, so alike in profile, brought a lump to her throat. Rather than dwelling on complicated emotions, Madeline set out to reacquaint herself with Sweetwater. The town had grown in her absence, with several new shops lining the main street. The mercantile was larger, and a proper dressmaker had set up shop next to the barber shop. As she browsed the storefronts, Madeline became aware of the stares and whispers following her. She had expected this. Sweetwater had always thrived on gossip, but the intensity of the attention was unsettling. "Madeline Lawson, as I live and breathe." She turned to find Martha Perkins, once her closest friend, hurrying toward her. The years had been kind to Martha, who had married the town's young doctor shortly before Madeline left. "It's Madeline Carter now," she corrected gently as Martha embraced her. "Of course, I heard you were widowed. I'm so sorry." Martha linked arms with her. "You must join me for tea. I want to hear everything about Denver." Over tea at Martha's comfortable home near the church, Madeline found herself subject to a gentle but thorough interrogation. "So the boy is Xavier's?" Martha asked, cutting directly to the heart of the matter. Madeline nodded. "James, he's 9. And Xavier never knew." "Not until yesterday," Madeline admitted. "My husband's dying wish was for James to meet his real father." Martha's eyes softened. "Your husband sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Madeline agreed. "The best father James could have asked for. And now?" "What are your plans?" Madeline stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I'm not sure yet. I sold our house in Denver. I thought perhaps we might settle here. James deserves to know his father, and I have nowhere else to go." Martha reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "You know there will be talk." "There always is," Madeline replied with a rueful smile. "Xavier never married," Martha said carefully. "There were women, of course. He's a handsome man with a good business, but nothing serious, not since you." Madeline absorbed this information silently. It shouldn't matter to her whether Xavier had found someone else. She had married Richard, built a life without Xavier, and yet a small, traitorous part of her heart fluttered at the news. "It's not like that," she said finally. "I'm not here to rekindle anything with Xavier. I'm here for James." Martha's knowing smile suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, whatever your reasons, I'm glad you're back. Sweetwater hasn't been the same without you." After finishing her tea, Madeline continued her explorations of the town, eventually finding herself outside her father's old bank. A new sign hung above the door, First National Bank of Sweetwater, but the building itself was unchanged. "Can I help you, madam?" asked a young clerk as she entered. "I was wondering if Mr. Harrison still works here." Mr. Harrison had been her father's partner, a kind man who had always slipped her peppermint candies when she visited the bank as a child. "Mr. Harrison passed on 3 winters ago, madam," the clerk informed her. "Mr. Blackett owns the bank now." Xavier Blackett? Madeline asked, certain she had misheard. Yes, madam. Bought it from Mr. Harrison's widow. Owns half the saloon, too, and the livery stable. Madeline thanked him and left, her mind whirling. Xavier, a businessman. The wild young cowboy she had known had apparently become quite the entrepreneur in her absence. As noon approached, she made her way back to the hotel, where Xavier and James were just returning from their ride. James's face was flushed with excitement, his hair windblown. Mama. Papa showed me how to make pepper gallop, and we saw a real coyote. Xavier dismounted smoothly, then helped James down. He's a natural, Maddie, sits a horse like he was born to it. Did you behave? She asked James, straightening his collar. Yes, madam, James replied. Papa says I'm the best rider he's ever seen for my age. Xavier's expression softened at the boy's use of Papa. He did real well, he confirmed. Smart kid you've raised. Thank you, she said, unsure whether to be pleased or unnerved by how quickly James had taken to calling Xavier Papa. It had been Mr. Carter for Richard for several months after their marriage. I was hoping you both might join me for dinner, Xavier said. At my house. It's not far from town. You have a house? Madeline couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. The Xavier she had known had lived in a room above the sheriff's office, claiming to need nothing more. A wry smile touched his lips. A lot's changed in 10 years, Maddie. I've done well for myself. So I heard. The bank, the livery. A man needs investments, he said with a shrug. So dinner? Around 6, she hesitated, aware that accepting would be crossing some invisible line. Yesterday, she had brought James to meet his father. Today, they had gone riding. Dinner at Xavier's home felt like another step towards something she wasn't sure she was ready for. Please, Mama. James pleaded. Papa said he might show me his gun collection, under proper supervision, Xavier added hastily, catching Madeline's alarmed look. She sighed. All right, dinner at 6. Xavier's smile was warm. I'll send a buggy for you. He tipped his hat. Until then, Mrs. Carter. After he left, leading both horses toward the livery, James tugged at her sleeve. I like him, Mama. He knows everything about horses and guns and being a cowboy. I'm glad you like him, she said, smoothing his hair. He seems to like you too. He asked a lot of questions about you, James said innocently. About what you like to eat and if you still play the piano. Madeline felt her cheeks warm. Did he now? And what did you tell him? I told him you like chicken and dumplings best, and that you still play sometimes, but only sad songs since Pa died. She winced at her son's perceptiveness. Well, let's get you cleaned up for dinner. You smell like horse. That evening, the promised buggy arrived promptly at 6, driven by a young, stable hand who tipped his hat respectfully. Mr. Blackett sent me to fetch you, madam. The drive took them out of town, following a well-maintained road that wound through stands of cottonwood trees. After about 15 minutes, they crested a small hill, revealing a substantial ranch house nestled in a protected valley. A barn and corral stood nearby, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the rolling plains. Is this all Papa's? James asked, his eyes wide. Appears so, Madeline replied, equally stunned. This was no small holding, but a proper ranch, the kind that required significant investment and management. The buggy pulled up to the house, a handsome 2-story structure with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Xavier emerged from the front door as they arrived, dressed in clean trousers and a fresh shirt, his hair still damp from washing. Welcome to Blackett Ranch, he said, helping them down from the buggy. It's not much, but it's home. Not much, Madeline couldn't help but laugh. Xavier, it's impressive. A hint of pride crossed his face. Started with 20 acres and a tumble-down shack, built it up bit by bit. Inside, the house was simply but comfortably furnished, with solid pieces that spoke of quality rather than ostentation. A woman of indeterminate age bustled out from what appeared to be the kitchen. "Mrs. Ramirez, my housekeeper," Xavier introduced. "Mrs. Ramirez, this is Mrs. Carter and her son James." The woman nodded, her dark eyes shrewd as they took in Madeline and James. "Dinner is ready, Mr. Blackett. I set it in the dining room like you asked." "Thank you, Mrs. Ramirez. You can head home now. I'll see to the dishes." After the housekeeper departed, Xavier gave them a brief tour of the downstairs, a comfortable parlor, a study lined with books that surprised Madeline, and finally the dining room, where a meal was laid out on a polished oak table. "You read now?" she couldn't help asking as they took their seats. Xavier chuckled. "A man can change, Maddie. I've had time to educate myself." The dinner was delicious roast chicken with all the trimmings, followed by an apple pie that Xavier admitted Mrs. Ramirez had baked specially. "She was quite curious about my sudden dinner guests," he said, serving James a second helping of pie. "I believe her exact words were, 'Who is this woman who has you cleaning the house yourself?'" Madeline smiled. "She seems protective of you. She's been with me 5 years. Came with her husband to work the ranch, but he passed on last winter. Pneumonia." "I'm sorry to hear that." James, who had been remarkably well behaved throughout dinner, suddenly yawned widely. "Someone's tired," Xavier observed. "Big day of riding will do that." "We should head back to town," Madeline said, rising from the table. "Stay," Xavier said, then quickly added, "The house has 5 bedrooms. Most are empty. No sense riding back in the dark when there's plenty of room here." She hesitated. "We didn't bring anything." "I have nightshirts that would swallow James whole but work in a pinch, and Mrs. Ramirez keeps spare toiletries for guests." "Please, Mama," James pleaded. "Papa said he'd show me the foals in the morning." The repeated "Papa" still jarred her, but Madeline found herself nodding. "All right. Just for tonight." While Xavier showed James to a bedroom and found him a nightshirt, Madeline wandered into the study, curious about the books that lined the walls. To her surprise, she found volumes of poetry, history, and even some novels she recognized. "My mother loved books," Xavier said from the doorway, making her jump. "Most of these were hers. I've added some over the years." "I never knew that about your mother," she said, realizing how little they had actually shared of their pasts during their passionate affair. "You hardly spoke of your family." "Not much to tell. Pa was a rancher in East Texas, died when I was 14. Ma held on another 10 years, long enough to see me grown. She'd have liked you." "You think so?" "I know so." He stepped into the room, closing the distance between them. "You were always too good for me, Maddie. Smart, educated. Your father knew it too." "My father was a snob," she said flatly. "He judged men by their bank accounts, not their character." "Maybe he wasn't entirely wrong," Xavier said, his voice soft. "I couldn't have given you much back then." "I didn't want much," she replied. "Just you." The words hung between them, charged with a decade of unspoken regrets. Xavier moved closer, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap on his skin. "And now?" he asked, his voice husky. "What do you want now, Maddie?" She stepped back, creating distance. "A good life for my son, a chance for him to know his father." Xavier nodded, accepting the boundary she'd established. "James is settled in. I put you in the room across the hall from his. There are some of Mrs. Ramirez's things you can use: nightgown, brush, whatever you need." "Thank you," she said, grateful for the change of subject. "Your home is lovely, Xavier. You've done well for yourself." "It was empty until tonight," he said simply, then turned toward the door. "Sleep well, Maddie." Alone in the guest bedroom, Madeline changed into the borrowed nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, her thoughts in turmoil. Xavier had changed, or perhaps he had simply grown into the man he was always meant to be, given time and opportunity. The reckless cowboy had become a successful businessman and rancher, with responsibilities and roots in the community. And yet, when he looked at her, she still saw echoes of the young man who had swept her off her feet at 19, who had taught her what passion meant in stolen moments behind her father's bank, in the hayloft of the livery stable, under the stars on summer nights. She thought of Richard's steady, kind Richard, who had married her knowing she carried another man's child, who had never once reproached her for her past. She had grown to love him in her way, though it had never matched the wild, consuming love she had felt for Xavier. With a sigh, she blew out the lamp and slipped under the covers, determined to keep her focus on James and his needs, not on the unsettling feelings Xavier's proximity awakened. Morning arrived with the sounds of a working ranch, distant cattle lowing, horses nickering, men calling to each other as they began their day's work. Madeline dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes, grateful they weren't too rumpled, and went to check on James. His room was empty, the bed hastily made. Alarmed, she hurried downstairs, following the sound of voices to the kitchen. There she found James perched on a stool at the kitchen table, watching in fascination as Xavier demonstrated how to properly clean a revolver. The gun was disassembled, its parts arranged neatly on a cloth. "Xavier," she exclaimed, "what are you doing?" Both males looked up, startled. "Teaching James about gun safety," Xavier replied. "Every boy his age should know not to touch a firearm unless properly supervised." "He's 9, she protested. "I was handling my pa's rifle at 7, Xavier countered. "Better he learns respect for weapons now than curiosity gets the better of him later." She wanted to argue but recognized the logic in his position. Still, the sight of her son so close to a weapon, even a disassembled one, made her uneasy. "Have you had breakfast?" she asked instead. "Mrs. Ramirez made flapjacks," James said excitedly. "And Papa said after breakfast he'd show me the foals like he promised." "I need to get back to town," she said. "I have appointments to keep." Xavier nodded. "I can bring him back this afternoon if you'd like, or he could stay here for the day. I have some business in town tomorrow. We could both come then." She hesitated, torn between wanting James to spend time with his father and a natural reluctance to be separated from her son. "What business do you have that would allow you to watch a 9-year-old boy? Ranch hands can manage for a day," he said. "And James here could help me check the fence line on the north pasture." "Right, partner," James nodded enthusiastically. "Please, Mama, I'll be good, I promise." "All right," she agreed reluctantly, "but I want him back in town by supper time. And no more gun lessons without discussing it with me first." Xavier raised his hands in surrender. "Yes, madam. No more guns today, just horses and fence lines." After breakfast, one of the ranch hands drove Madeline back to town in the buggy. As they pulled away, she looked back to see Xavier and James standing on the porch, waving. The sight her son with his father, both so alike in stance and coloring, brought a lump to her throat. In town, Madeline used the day to make inquiries about available properties. If they were to stay in Sweetwater, they would need a home of their own. The thought of remaining indefinitely at the hotel was unappealing. The real estate agent, a portly man named Mr. Finch, showed her several options: a small house near the school, an apartment above the new dressmaker's shop, and a cottage on the outskirts of town that needed considerable repairs. "Properties are at a premium these days," Mr. Finch explained as they viewed the cottage. "Ever since the railroad came through last year, Sweetwater's been growing steady." "I'll need to think about it," Madeline said, mentally calculating her remaining funds. Richard had left them comfortably provided for, but establishing a new home would require careful planning. "No rush, Mrs. Carter," Mr. Finch assured her. "Though I should mention, if you're interested in the house near the school, I have another party looking at it tomorrow." By late afternoon, Madeline had returned to the hotel to freshen up before James's return. She was just changing into a clean dress when a commotion in the street drew her to the window. A group of men on horseback had ridden into town, their manner aggressive as they dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. She recognized their type immediately: troublemakers, possibly drunk, looking for entertainment at the town's expense. Her concern deepened when she spotted Xavier riding into town from the opposite direction, James seated in front of him on Thunderbolt. They were laughing about something, unaware of the potential danger ahead. Hurrying downstairs and out onto the boardwalk, Madeline watched anxiously as Xavier noticed the men. His posture changed instantly, becoming alert, protective. He dismounted smoothly, lifting James down and speaking to him briefly before pointing toward the hotel. James spotted her and ran over. "Mama, Papa says I should stay with you while he talks to those men." "What's happening?" she asked, drawing him close. "I don't know. Papa just got real serious all of a sudden." They watched as Xavier approached the group, his stance casual but his hand resting near his holstered gun. The sheriff emerged from his office, similarly cautious. "Who are they?" Madeline asked a shopkeeper who had stepped outside to observe. "Trouble," the man replied grimly. "Barton brothers and their crew. Been causing problems up and down the valley. Sheriff ran them out of town last month for starting a brawl at the Silver Dollar." The confrontation appeared tense but controlled, with Xavier and the sheriff speaking calmly to the leader of the group. After several minutes, the men remounted, casting dark looks at Xavier before riding slowly out of town. "That's showing them, Xav," someone called from the crowd that had gathered. Xavier spoke briefly with the sheriff before walking over to where Madeline stood with James. "Sorry about that," he said, his expression tight. "Barton boys have a grudge against me. I won their ranch in a poker game last year, fair and square, but they don't see it that way." "Are they dangerous?" she asked, still holding James close. Xavier's eyes hardened. "They're all talk. But I think it's best if you and James stay at my place tonight, just to be safe." "Is that really necessary?" She didn't want to overreact, but the protective way Xavier positioned himself between them and the direction the men had ridden spoke volumes. "Probably not," he admitted. "But I'd rest easier knowing you were both safe at the ranch. I have men there, good men who know how to handle trouble." James tugged at her sleeve. "Can we, Mama, please? Mrs. Ramirez said she'd teach me to make tortillas tomorrow." Madeline sighed. "We'll need to pack a few things from the hotel." "I'll wait here," Xavier said, his eyes still scanning the street. "Be quick." They gathered essential items quickly, Madeline's mind racing with worry. She had not anticipated finding herself in the middle of Xavier's feuds, especially not with James potentially at risk. When they returned downstairs, Xavier was waiting with the buggy. "Sheriff's sending a couple of deputies to ride with us, just as a precaution," he explained as he helped them up. The ride to the ranch was tense, with Xavier constantly scanning the surrounding countryside. The deputies rode ahead and behind, alert for any sign of trouble. "I'm sorry about this, Maddie," Xavier said quietly as James dozed against her shoulder. "I wouldn't have brought James to town if I'd known the Bartons were around." "It's not your fault," she replied, though part of her wanted to blame him for exposing James to potential danger. "You couldn't have known. Still, a man in my position makes enemies. It's one of the reasons I always said I wasn't cut out for family life." He glanced at James's sleeping form. "Having people you care about, it gives men like the Bartons leverage." The implication that he cared about them enough to worry about their safety warmed something inside her, despite her concern. At the ranch, Xavier personally escorted them inside while his foreman organized the hands to keep watch through the night. Mrs. Ramirez, who had been about to leave for her own small house on the property, was enlisted to prepare rooms for Madeline and James. "Is this exciting, Mama?" James asked as she tucked him into bed. "Like in my adventure books. A little too exciting," she replied, smoothing his hair. "But there's nothing to worry about. Your father has everything under control. He's brave," James said sleepily. "Just like you always said." After James fell asleep, Madeline made her way downstairs, finding Xavier in his study with a glass of whiskey. He looked up as she entered, the lamplight casting shadows across his face. "James asleep?" he asked. "Yes, he thinks this is all very exciting." Xavier's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Boys his age would, I know I would have." She took a seat across from him. "Will there really be trouble?" He considered his answer. "The Bartons are mostly bluster, but they are unpredictable when drinking, which they usually are. I'm not taking chances, not with you and James here." "This is precisely why you said you couldn't settle down, isn't it?" she asked. "The danger of your position." "Partly," he admitted. "Though I'm more businessman than gunslinger these days, but yes, I've made enemies, men who might target those close to me. And yet you've built all this," she gestured around her. "A home, a ranch, businesses in town, that speaks of putting down roots." Xavier stared into his glass. "Maybe I was preparing for something without knowing it, or someone." The implication hung between them, heavy with meaning. Madeline looked away, unwilling to meet his gaze. "I should get some rest," she said finally, rising from her chair. Xavier stood as well, setting down his glass. "Maddie," he said, his voice low, "I need to know, if I had asked you to stay 10 years ago, if I had offered marriage, would you have accepted?" The question caught her off guard. "Yes," she answered honestly. "I loved you, Xavier. Enough to defy my father, to accept whatever life you could offer." Pain flashed across his features. "I was a fool. We were both young," she said gently. "And now we have James. Whatever else happened between us, he's what matters now." Xavier nodded, his expression clearing. "You're right." "Good night, Maddie." "Good night," she replied, slipping from the room before the temptation to linger became too strong. The next few days passed without incident. The Barton brothers did not appear, and gradually the tension at the ranch eased. Xavier insisted Madeline and James remain as his guests, arguing that returning to the hotel would be an unnecessary risk, until he was certain the trouble had passed. For James, the arrangement was paradise. He spent his days learning about ranch life, shadowing Xavier as he went about his business, and soaking up every bit of attention his newfound father lavished upon him. For Madeline, the situation was more complicated. Being in Xavier's home, watching him with their son, stirred feelings she had long thought buried. The way he patiently taught James to ride properly, the gentle corrections when James spoke out of turn, the obvious pride in his eyes when James mastered a new skill, all of it revealed a side of Xavier she had never seen before. On the 4th day, she found Xavier in the barn, brushing down Thunderbolt after a morning ride. James was with Mrs. Ramirez, learning to make the promised tortillas. "We can't stay here indefinitely," she said without preamble. "I need to make decisions about our future. Find a house, consider James's schooling." Xavier continued brushing the horse, his movements rhythmic. "You could stay here," he said quietly. "Both of you." She stared at him. "What exactly are you suggesting, Xavier?" He set down the brush and turned to face her. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I just know that having you and James here, it feels right, Maddie, in a way nothing has for a very long time." "We barely know each other anymore," she protested. 10 years changes people. Then let me court you properly, he suggested, stepping closer. Let me show you the man I've become. Let me prove I can be the father James deserves, the husband you once wanted. Husband, she echoed, her heart hammering. Xavier, you can't possibly, why not? He challenged. We have a son together. There's still something between us, don't tell me you don't feel it too. She couldn't deny it, the attraction that had drawn them together a decade ago had never truly died. It had merely been buried under years of separation and the lives they had built apart. Richard has only been gone 3 months, she said, her voice unsteady. Xavier's expression softened. I'm not asking for an answer today, Maddie. Just a chance. Stay in Sweetwater. Let me court you. Let's see if what we once had can be rebuilt stronger this time. Before she could respond, a shout came from the direction of the house. They both turned to see one of the ranch hands running toward them. Mr. Blackett, riders coming. Looks like the Bartons and they're armed. Xavier's expression hardened instantly. Get to the house, he told Madeline. Make sure James stays inside with Mrs. Ramirez. Xavier, go, Maddie. Now. She hurried to the house, fear clawing at her throat. Inside, she found James in the kitchen, happily pressing tortilla dough with Mrs. Ramirez. Mama, look what I made. That's wonderful, darling, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Let's go upstairs for a bit, shall we? Mrs. Ramirez gave her a sharp look. Trouble, Madeline nodded. The Bartons. The older woman's expression darkened. Dios mío. She wiped her hands on her apron. I will close the shutters. From an upstairs window, Madeline watched as Xavier and his men gathered in front of the house. 6 riders approached down the long drive, led by a burly man she assumed was one of the Barton brothers. She couldn't hear the exchange, but the body language was clear enough. Xavier stood his ground, one hand resting near his holstered gun, as the lead rider gesticulated angrily. After several tense minutes, the confrontation seemed to ease. The riders backed their horses away, though they did not leave. Xavier entered the house moments later, his expression grim. They want to talk, he said. Frank Barton claims he has a proposition. You can't trust them, Mrs. Ramirez said sharply from where she was securing a shutter. I don't, Xavier agreed, but I need to hear them out. It might be the only way to end this peacefully. Madeline followed him downstairs. What kind of proposition could they possibly have? Frank says he wants to buy back his ranch, claims he's come into some money and can pay fair price. You believe him? Xavier's mouth twisted. No, but I need to find out what game he's playing. He strapped on his gun belt, checking that his revolver was loaded. Stay inside. Keep James away from the windows. Be careful, she said, touching his arm briefly. He covered her hand with his own. Always am. From the parlor window, Madeline watched as Xavier walked back out to meet the Bartons alone. The tension in his shoulders betrayed his wariness, though his stride remained confident. The discussion appeared more civil this time, with Frank Barton dismounting to speak with Xavier face to face. After several minutes, they shook hands, and the Bartons turned their horses to leave. Xavier watched them go, waiting until they were well down the drive before returning to the house. Well, Madeline asked as he entered the parlor. Frank claims he won big in a poker game in Fort Worth, wants to buy back the family ranch. Xavier sounded skeptical. I told him I'd consider a fair offer, but he'd need to prove he has the money first. And he accepted that, seemed to. Too easily, if you ask me. Xavier ran a hand through his hair. I don't trust him, but if there's a chance to end this feud legitimately, I need to consider it. For James's sake, she said quietly. Xavier's eyes met hers. For all our sakes, Maddie. That evening, after James was in bed, Xavier found Madeline on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. He joined her silently, leaning against the railing beside her. "You never answered my proposal," he said after a comfortable silence. "About letting me court you," she sighed. "It's complicated, Xavier. We have James to consider." "James seems pretty happy with the arrangement so far," he pointed out. "He's taken to calling me Papa like he's been doing it his whole life." "That's what worries me," she admitted. "He's becoming attached so quickly. What if this doesn't work out? What if we find we're too different now? He would be devastated." Xavier turned to face her. "Maddie, I'm not the same reckless kid I was 10 years ago. When I make a commitment now, I stand by it." "And what exactly are you committing to?" she challenged. "Courting me? Or something more?" He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm committing to trying. To seeing if what we had, what I threw away, can be rebuilt, and if it can." He hesitated. "If it can, I'm committing to making you and James my family, properly, permanently." The sincerity in his eyes made her breath catch. "I need time, Xavier, to be sure this is right for all of us." "Take all the time you need," he said. "Just promise you'll stay in Sweetwater while you decide. Don't disappear on me again." "I promise," she whispered. Impulsively, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, so different from the passionate embraces of their youth. When he pulled back, his eyes searched hers. "I never stopped loving you, Maddie," he said softly. "Not for a single day in 10 years. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hooves broke the moment. Xavier straightened, instantly alert, hand moving to his gun. "Stay on the porch," he instructed, moving to the steps as one of his ranch hands rode up. "Mr. Blackett," the man called urgently. "Fire at the north pasture. Looks deliberate," Xavier swore under his breath. "Wake the men, get the water wagon." He turned to Madeline. "Stay with James, lock the doors." She nodded, fear clutching her heart as she watched him mount Thunderbolt bareback and ride off into the darkness, following the ranch hand. Inside, she checked on James, finding him still peacefully asleep, unaware of the drama unfolding. Mrs. Ramirez appeared in the hallway, a shotgun in her hands. "I will watch the boy," she said firmly. "You watch the windows." For hours, Madeline paced the house, peering anxiously into the darkness. In the distance, an orange glow lit the horizon where the fire burned. Would the Bartons truly go this far in their vendetta? Burning Pastureland was not just a threat to Xavier's property, but potentially to the entire valley if the fire spread. It was nearly dawn when the men returned, exhausted and smoke-stained. Xavier looked grim as he entered the house, his clothes filthy, his face streaked with soot. "How bad?" Madeline asked, handing him a cup of coffee from the pot Mrs. Ramirez had kept brewing through the night. "Bad enough," he replied, his voice rough from smoke. "We contained it but lost about 50 acres of good grazing land. Could have been worse. The Bartons," his eyes hardened, "had to be too convenient, coming just hours after our civil conversation." He sank into a chair, suddenly looking every year of his age and then some. "This can't continue, Maddie, not with you and James here." "What will you do?" she asked, sitting across from him. "End it," he said simply. "One way or another." The determination in his voice sent a chill through her. "Xavier, please don't do anything reckless, for James's sake." "It's precisely for James's sake that I need to resolve this," he countered. "I can't have him growing up in the shadow of a feud, can't have him worrying every time I ride out that I might not come back." She reached across the table to take his hand. "Then do it legally. Involve the sheriff, the law." Xavier squeezed her hand. "I'll try, but men like the Bartons rarely respect the law." Later that morning, after Xavier had cleaned up and gotten a few hours' sleep, he rode into town to speak with the sheriff. Madeline remained at the ranch with James, who was full of questions about the fire and the commotion in the night. "Was it bad men, Mama?" he asked as they sat on the porch, watching Xavier disappear down the drive. "Some men who are angry with your father," she explained carefully. "But everything will be all right. Papa will stop them," James said with absolute confidence. "He's the bravest man in Texas." The faith in his voice brought tears to her eyes. In just a few days, Xavier had become a hero to his son, the father figure James had longed for since Richard's death. The thought of anything happening to shatter that newfound relationship was unbearable. Xavier returned mid-afternoon, accompanied by the sheriff and 2 deputies. They spoke briefly in the yard before the lawmen continued on, presumably toward the Barton property. "Sheriff's going to issue a warning," Xavier explained as he joined Madeline on the porch. "If they're found to be responsible for the fire, they'll face charges." "Will that be enough?" she asked. "Probably not," he admitted. "But it's a start. Shows them I'm not acting alone." He sat beside her on the porch swing. "Where's James?" "Helping Mrs. Ramirez gather eggs. She says he has a natural way with the hens." Xavier smiled. "He's a good boy, Maddie. You've done a fine job raising him." "Richard deserves much of the credit," she said. "He was a wonderful father." "I'm grateful to him," Xavier said sincerely, "for loving you both when I couldn't." The simple acknowledgement brought tears to her eyes. "He knew about you," she confessed. "I told him everything before we married. He said he'd be honored to raise another man's son, especially a son born of love." Xavier was silent for a long moment. "He must have been a remarkable man." "He was," she agreed. "Different from you in many ways, but similar in the ones that matter most: honorable, kind, strong in his convictions." "I have a lot to live up to," Xavier said quietly. "You don't have to replace him," she assured him. "James needs you to be yourself. That's enough." They sat in companionable silence, the porch swing creaking gently as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon. In that peaceful moment, Madeline could almost believe in the possibility of a future here with Xavier, with James as a family. The peace was shattered by the sound of gunfire in the distance. Xavier was on his feet instantly, his hand on his gun. "Get inside," he ordered, his voice hard. More shots rang out, followed by shouting. A ranch hand came running from the barn. "Mr. Blackett, riders coming fast from the east pasture. Sounds like they're exchanging fire with someone," Xavier cursed. "The sheriff and his men. The Bartons must have ambushed them." He turned to Madeline. "Get James and Mrs. Ramirez. Lock yourselves in the root cellar beneath the kitchen. Don't come out until I call for you. Xavier, now, Maddie." His eyes softened briefly. "Please, I need to know you're safe." She ran to find James, her heart pounding. Mrs. Ramirez was already hurrying toward the house with the boy, having heard the shots. "Quickly," Madeline urged, guiding them to the kitchen. "Into the cellar." "What's happening, Mama?" James asked, his eyes wide with fear. "Just a precaution, darling," she said, trying to keep her voice steady as Mrs. Ramirez lifted the trapdoor in the kitchen floor. "Like a game of hide and seek." The root cellar was cool and dark, smelling of earth and preserved vegetables. Mrs. Ramirez lit a lantern as Madeline closed the trapdoor above them. "Will Papa be all right?" James whispered, pressing close to Madeline's side. "Of course he will," she assured him, praying she was right. "Your father is very brave and very smart." Above them, they could hear the commotion of men running, shouted orders, the continued crack of gunfire that seemed to be drawing closer to the house. Madeline held James tightly, whispering reassurances even as her own fear threatened to overwhelm her. The minutes stretched endlessly. Mrs. Ramirez murmured prayers in Spanish, her rosary beads clicking through her fingers. James, sensing the gravity of the situation despite Madeline's attempts to shield him, had fallen silent, his small body tense against hers. Finally, the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the gunfire had been. Who had prevailed? Was Xavier safe? Or had the Bartons? She couldn't complete the thought. Footsteps crossed the kitchen floor above them. Heavy boots, multiple sets. Madeline held her breath, one hand covering James's mouth to ensure his silence. "Madeline," Xavier's voice called, "it's safe now. You can come out." Relief flooded through her. She helped Mrs. Ramirez up the ladder first, then lifted James up before climbing out herself. Xavier stood in the kitchen, his shirt torn and bloodied on one sleeve. Behind him, the sheriff looked equally disheveled. "Papa," James cried, running to Xavier, who knelt to embrace him. "I'm all right, son," he assured the boy. "Just a scratch." Madeline approached more cautiously. "What happened?" "The Bartons decided to take matters into their own hands," the sheriff explained grimly. "Ambushed us on the road, then headed here. Seems they figured if they couldn't have their ranch back, they'd make sure Xavier couldn't enjoy it either." "Are they?" She couldn't finish the question with James present. "Frank Barton's dead," Xavier said quietly. "His brother Tom's wounded in custody. The rest scattered." "Mr. Blackett acted in defense of his property and in aid of the law," the sheriff added, his tone making it clear this was the official version of events. "There'll be an inquest, but it's a formality. No one will fault him for protecting his home." Xavier's eyes met Madeline's over James's head. "It's over," he said simply. "They won't be back." That night, after the sheriff had departed with his prisoner and the ranch had settled into an uneasy calm, Madeline found Xavier on the porch again. His arm was properly bandaged now, the bullet graze cleaned and dressed by Mrs. Ramirez. "How's James?" he asked as she joined him. "Asleep, finally. He was worried about you," Xavier sighed. "This isn't what I wanted him to see, to know about me." "He sees a father who protected his family," she said gently. "That's all." "Is that how you see it?" he asked, turning to face her. "Because a man died today, Maddie, by my hand. A man who was threatening innocent people," she pointed out. "Who had already tried to burn your land and who ambushed the sheriff. You did what you had to do." He nodded slowly, though the troubled look remained in his eyes. "This is the life I didn't want to drag you into, why I pushed you away 10 years ago. The violence, the enemies." "And yet here we are," she said softly. "Here we are," he echoed. "Which brings me back to my question from before. Will you let me court you, Madeline Carter, properly this time? No secrets, no holding back." She studied his face in the moonlight, the lines etched by time and hardship, the steadiness in his gaze that had replaced the restless fire of youth. This was not the same man who had broken her heart a decade ago. This was a man who had built something enduring, who had faced his demons and emerged stronger. A man who might, given the chance, be the husband and father she and James needed. "Yes," she said finally. "I will." The smile that spread across his face was like the sunrise breaking over the plains, warm, illuminating, full of promise. He pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of his injury, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I won't waste this second chance, Maddie," he vowed. "I promise you that." Over the following weeks, Xavier courted Madeline with a dedication that surprised and delighted her. Despite his responsibilities at the ranch and in town, he made time each day to call on her and James at the small house they had rented near the school, the very one Mr. Finch had shown her before the trouble with the Bartons began. He brought flowers, took them on picnics by the creek, arranged for a piano to be delivered to their home when he learned Madeline had been forced to sell Richards before leaving Denver. Small gestures that spoke of thoughtfulness rather than extravagance. For James, he was an attentive and patient father, teaching him to ride properly, to fish, to identify the stars at night. He attended the boys' first day at the Sweetwater school, standing proudly beside Madeline as their son entered the building. "He has your brains," Xavier remarked as they walked back toward town. "Teacher says he's already reading above his grade." "And your charm," Madeline countered. "He's made friends already." The people of Sweetwater, after initial curiosity and inevitable gossip, had largely accepted the unusual situation. The fact that Xavier Blackett had a son he hadn't known about was certainly fodder for conversation, but his obvious pride in the boy and his respectful courting of Madeline soon won over even the most conservative members of the community. "Mrs. Perkins is organizing a social at the church next Saturday," Madeline mentioned as they reached the corner where their paths would diverge. She to the dressmaker's shop where she had found part-time work, he to the bank. "She specifically asked if we would attend." Xavier grimaced slightly. "A church social, with cake walks and singing, and eligible young ladies for the town's most prosperous bachelor," she teased. "Though I believe your eligibility is now in question." He caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "There's no question in my mind, Maddie. Hasn't been since you stepped off that stagecoach." The courtship progressed steadily through the summer and into the autumn. Xavier was careful not to rush her, mindful of her relatively recent widowhood and the adjustments James was making to his new life. But his intentions were clear in every glance, every touch, every moment spent building a relationship not just with her, but with their son. In late October, as the first chill of winter touched Sweetwater, Xavier invited Madeline and James to Sunday dinner at the ranch. It had become a weekly tradition, but something in his manner suggested this Sunday might be different. "Wear your blue dress," he said as he left them at their door on Friday evening. "The one that matches your eyes." The dress in question was her best, saved for special occasions. "Are we celebrating something?" she asked. He merely smiled. "Perhaps." On Sunday, when Xavier collected them in his buggy, James was bubbling with excitement that seemed to exceed the usual anticipation of Mrs. Ramirez's cooking. "You know something I don't?" Madeline asked her son suspiciously as they rode toward the ranch. James tried to look innocent, a feat he had never mastered. "No, Mama," Xavier chuckled. "Leave the boy be, Maddie. He's just hungry for Mrs. Ramirez's apple pie." But when they arrived at the ranch, it was clear this was no ordinary Sunday dinner. The house had been decorated with autumn flowers and ribbons. Mrs. Ramirez, dressed in her Sunday best, greeted them at the door with a knowing smile. "What's all this?" Madeline asked as Xavier helped her down from the buggy. "A special occasion," he replied, offering no further explanation. Inside, the table was set with Xavier's best china and silver, a fine linen tablecloth covering the oak surface. A small velvet box sat beside Madeline's place setting. "Xavier," she breathed, understanding dawning. He guided her to her chair, then knelt beside it, taking her hand in his. James stood nearby, practically vibrating with excitement. "Madeline Lawson Carter," Xavier began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. 10 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life when I let you go. I told myself it was for your own good, that I couldn't offer you the life you deserved. I was young and foolish and afraid." He glanced at James, who gave him an encouraging nod. "When you came back into my life with our son, you gave me a gift I never thought I'd have a second chance. These past months, watching you with James building something together, they've been the happiest of my life." He reached for the velvet box, opening it to reveal a diamond ring, simple but elegant. "I'm asking you to complete that happiness, to make our family official in the eyes of God and the law. Will you marry me, Maddie? Will you be my wife, my partner, the mother of our children?" Tears filled her eyes as she looked from Xavier to James, who was watching with hopeful anticipation. and back again. This man, who had once broken her heart, had shown her through actions rather than words that he was worthy of a second chance, that he could be the husband and father they needed. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you." His face lit with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. James whooped with delight, rushing to embrace them both. "I knew you'd say yes," he exclaimed. "Papa and I have been planning this for weeks. Have you now?" Madeline laughed through her tears. "Is that why you've been so secretive lately?" "Papa said I could be his best man," James confided. "And that after you're married, we'll all live here at the ranch, and maybe I might get a brother or sister someday." Xavier had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I might have gotten ahead of myself in the planning department." Madeline touched his face gently. "I think your plans sound perfect, all of them." They were married on Christmas Eve in the small church in Sweetwater, with James proudly standing as best man. Martha Perkins served as matron of honor, and Mrs. Ramirez wept openly throughout the ceremony. The town turned out in force for the celebration afterward, held at the Silver Dollar Saloon, which had been transformed for the occasion with evergreen boughs and red ribbons. Even the banker who had replaced Madeline's father attended, raising a toast to the couple who had overcome time and circumstance to find their way back to each other. As midnight approached, Xavier drew Madeline away from the festivities and out onto the porch of the saloon. Snow had begun to fall, dusting Sweetwater with white that glittered in the lamplight. "Happy, Mrs. Blackett?" he asked, his arms circling her waist. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace, "though I'm still getting used to the name." "You have a lifetime to practice," he murmured, kissing her gently. "A lifetime for us to make up for the years we lost." Inside, they could hear James regaling a group of admiring adults with the story of how he had helped his father propose, his young voice animated with pride and happiness. "We should rescue our son before he becomes too full of himself," Madeline suggested with a laugh. "Our son," Xavier repeated, wonder in his voice. "I still can't quite believe it, Maddie, that he's mine, that you're both mine. Believe it," she said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "We're home, Xavier. Finally home." A year later, James gained the sister he had wished for, a dark-haired, blue-eyed girl they named Elizabeth, after Xavier's mother. 2 years after that, a brother joined the family, Richard Xavier Blackett, named for the two fathers who had shaped James's life. The Barton feud faded into memory as Sweetwater grew and prospered. Xavier expanded his businesses, eventually serving as mayor for 2 terms. Madeline established a small school of music, teaching piano to the children of the town. And James, who had once traveled across half the country to meet a father he knew only from his mother's stories, grew into a young man who combined the best qualities of both his parents, Xavier's courage and Madeline's compassion, bound together by the love that had brought them all home to Sweetwater. On warm summer evenings, when the work was done and the youngest children were in bed, Xavier and Madeline would often sit on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over land that had become the foundation of their family's legacy. Sometimes they spoke of the past, of the years apart, of Richard's kindness, of the day a small boy had called a stunned cowboy Papa for the first time. But mostly, they spoke of the future, of James's college plans, of Elizabeth's talent for music, of little Rick's apparent determination to ride every horse on the ranch before his 5th birthday. "Any regrets?" Xavier would sometimes ask, his fingers intertwined with hers. And Madeline would shake her head, watching the stars emerge above the Texas plains. "Not one," she would reply. "Every step we took led us here. How could I regret that?" In those moments, with the ranch quiet around them and their children safe under their roof, they both knew the truth that sometimes Love takes the longest, most winding path to find its way home. But when it arrives, carrying the hope of new beginnings and second chances, it is all the more precious for the journey.